As I say, I spoke to Kevin Rudd just a short while ago.
Kevin Rudd, thanks for your time. It's 5 years since you delivered that historic apology to the stolen generations. It was a day full of emotion. What was it like for you?
I think the miracle of the apology was that Aboriginal Australians accepted it, not that I delivered it. And if you were an Aboriginal Australian and you'd been through what Aboriginal Australians had been through for a couple of hundred years, frankly, you probably would have been within your rights to say, nice words, Kev, but frankly, thanks but no thanks. The miracle of the apology was that our Indigenous brothers and sisters wanted to make a new beginning themselves. That, for me, was what was most memorable about the day.
But how did you feel yourself? I mean, you had people in the chamber crying, people out in the lawns of Parliament and around the country, very emotional, as I say, about this day. And it was a great speech. Did you write the speech yourself? And what was it like to deliver it?
Well, of course I wrote it myself. For an apology to be genuine, it's got to be in your own words. It's got to be as you felt it, as you experienced it, and based on my conversations with members of the stolen generation. And so I didn't finish writing the thing until 10 minutes before I walked in.
Really?
That's the truth of it. Ask Anthony Albanese, leader of the House, who walked in with a slightly panicked look on his face saying, "You haven't finished it." I said, "Too right, comrade." So, but I think...
why was that? Why were you still finishing it off that late?
I had to get the words right. And as you know, as someone who puts pen to paper from time to time himself, the words sometimes come, the words sometimes take a while to come. So I was up until about 2 or 3 that morning writing. I'd started a couple of days before. Every brief I read was frankly useless. No criticism of the public servants, but they were doing their job. This had to go to the heart of what Aboriginal people had experienced. And for that to be real, I, as a white Australian male, had to deliver an apology. Someone who'd come here 8 generations ago, at least his forebears did, as white Australian occupiers. I also had to do so as the current Prime Minister of the country, and as I said the other day, the person ultimately responsible for the laws of the nation, Commonwealth and State. So it had to be, in your own words, to be effective.
Looking 5 years on, you point out that the apology was accepted. That was very important. But what difference do you think it's made in the healing of these wounds for the country and in the practical livelihood of Indigenous Australians?
Our relationship with Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islander Australians is like a relationship between any group of human beings. If you have deeply offended somebody, if you've deeply wounded them, you can't get on with the business of fixing a relationship until you've gone to the emotional fundamentals. So the apology, if you like, was doing some, deep, I won't say spiritual work, but some deep work to try and construct an emotional bridge back between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians. Because it's only once that work had been done can you get on with the practical business of closing the gap. The thing that I'm most focused on these days, and frankly was largely focused on the day itself, was how do we now, building on this spirit, close the gap in life expectancy in education, health, housing, employment. And that's why we set targets, timelines, and, to keep us all honest, an annual reporting framework.
Well, some of these targets are being met, some of them we haven't seen progress or so much progress. What is going wrong when it comes, and this is an issue that's vexed governments for years and years and years, what aren't we doing that we should be doing?
Well, the first thing that we've got right is to collect the data. When we first sat down, I remember this very clearly, 1 year after the apology, to present the first annual report to the Parliament on progress against the 6 targets we'd set in education, health, housing and the rest. What we discovered was that the data was just either non-existent or very poor. It took us 2 or 3 years to actually get robust sets of data so we could actually know what on earth's going on out there. Then secondly, now that the data is more robust, we can see where the improvements are occurring. Year 12 retention is improving. Early childhood education, we've reached the target we've set for ourselves. But on one other critical educational target, which is literacy and numeracy, we are at best maintaining where we were, and at worst, reading some of the data, falling backwards. That's why I gave a speech the other day about what do we now need to do to bring all the expertise together to work out what's still going wrong on the literacy and numeracy front?
Tony Abbott says as Prime Minister he'll continue to do what he's been doing for a long time, spending time in remote communities. Do you think that's something a Prime Minister should do? Does it make a difference?
Well, as Prime Minister, I took Cabinet to remote communities and conducted Cabinet meetings up in Arnhem Land. I don't know if you were there or not. And I think that's worthwhile, to bring the Cabinet out of Canberra into the regions and into Indigenous Australia as well. It's all good for Tony to go out there and wield a hammer. I'm all for that. Do you know something though? There are at least 900 schools like the one that Tony Abbott was working on. And so you can either go out and have a working bee with a school, and I'm all for that, with local community involvement, or at the level of government, you are out there making sure that all 900 plus schools, which take care of more than half of the enrolments of Indigenous primary school kids across the country, are properly resourced with the right teachers, with the right source material, and the other things which make attendance better and literacy and numeracy achievement where it should be.
Let me turn to the Pope, his resignation. Were you surprised by that, and do you think it was a good thing?
Well, like all Australians, I think most people around the world, watching television last night, I was stunned. The history is clear. It's hundreds of years since a Pope resigned while in office. And obviously Pope Benedict decided, just take his words as what they say in their own terms, that he was no longer feeling physically able to do the job. So full marks to him. He's made that decision, he's made that call. And I suppose if you're the Pope, you can.
Some have reflected that God normally decides when it's time for a Pope to resign. And in the words of Joe Hockey, in fact, it's a brave Pope that takes that decision, that power out of the hands of the Almighty.
You know something? As a non-denominational Christian myself, I know what it's appropriate for me to start talking about, and where the church leadership takes over on deep questions of theology and ecclesiastical practice, I'll leave that to the church hierarchy.
You did meet the Pope on a number of occasions. World Youth Day here in Australia, the canonisation of Mary MacKillop. He did have a tough act to follow in John Paul II. And he was often criticised for being too hardline on issues of abortion, euthanasia, homosexuality, ordination of women. Do you think that characterisation of him was too tough?
Well, I'll let others make those evaluations. I think what I can say about my own meetings with Pope Benedict, both in Australia during World Youth Day and then later in Rome on a couple of occasions, is that as Pope he had a deep affection for this country. He was literally blown away by World Youth Day. In fact, I think the good citizens of Sydney were blown away by World Youth Day. Crime rates went down. It was quite extraordinary. And remember, it was his decision, ultimately, concerning the canonisation of Australia's first saint, Mary MacKillop. So I think Australians, whether they are Catholic, non-Catholic Christians, or across the broader divide, have a deal of respect for that. I think tempering that, of course, is a view which I think many have shared, and I have myself, is that the Catholic Church, both nationally and globally, has moved far too slowly on the question of child abuse. And I think that is the reason why you see legislatures and governments stepping in across the world.
And would you include the Pope in that criticism, that he didn't do enough on child sexual abuse?
I think it's fair to say that over many decades, the Catholic hierarchy, without pointing to a particular individual, has been slow to recognise the dimensions of the problem, the depths of the problem, and the necessity for action. You see, at the end of the day, governments and legislatures only step into these matters when the relevant church authorities themselves haven't done the job properly, by referring all these cases comprehensively, etc., to the relevant judicial authorities, and cooperated fully. So I think this is not just a problem for Australia, not just a problem for Ireland, not just a problem for the United States. It's a global challenge, and dare I say it, not just for the Catholic Church.
Let me turn finally to a domestic matter, the mining tax. Now, You came up with the mining tax. It was watered down under Julia Gillard and Wayne Swan. It's now collected far less revenue than forecast. Do you think it can be amended to raise more revenue, or should be?
Well, the origin of the mining tax, as you know, came from the Henry Review, which was established by the Treasurer. The Treasurer brought it to the relevant ministers of the government, including the then Deputy Prime Minister and myself. We supported the Treasurer's decision to go forward with his proposal for the mining tax. And therefore,
sorry, Wayne Swan's proposal for the mining tax.
And the government supported him, led by myself and other senior ministers. Of course, after the government's leadership changed, the Treasurer and the new Prime Minister elected to make some significant changes to the structure of the tax. I think we're all familiar with what those changes are. So I think in terms of any future changes to the tax, given the fact that it has not collected any real revenue of any significance so far, that really is a matter for the Prime Minister and for the Treasurer to consider, and I'll leave it with them.
Does it disappoint you, though, that after all you went through and the government went through in trying to get this mining tax in place, it has collected, as you say, next to no revenue?
Well, as I said, the Treasurer, through his review, the Henry Review, brought this submission to both Julia Gillard and myself. We supported him, took it into the public debate. We all know how that ended. Then the new Prime Minister and the Treasurer elected to make these changes. So you see, what I'm unfamiliar with is what undertakings they also gave to the mining industry at that time. So when I say these are matters for the Prime Minister and for the Treasurer, of course that lies within their executive remit right now, but also they would need to be mindful of what undertakings they've given to the mining industry as well.
But do you think the Prime Minister and Treasurer gave away too much to those miners?
History will be the judge of that. I don't intend to provide a rolling commentary. My view has always been pretty basic. These resources are owned by the Australian people. We understand, and I'm from Queensland, that mining is a tough and expensive business. But I know from private conversations with the big miners in the lead up to the mining tax that they all knew that they had to pay more based on the super profits they were earning at the time. I believe the Australian people deserve, through an appropriate tax mix, an appropriate return on the resources which are ultimately theirs, because guess what? The taxpayer has to pay for the country's infrastructure, including that which services mining communities. The taxpayer has to provide funding for the NBN. The taxpayer has to provide funding for a range of other infrastructure measures as well. So therefore, our mining companies, which have paid a huge amount of tax over the years, I think have had obligations in this area as well. But on the final taxation mix, that's a matter for the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, the Treasury. They'll also know what the other revenue sources are, which is available to the government, how they're likely to develop over time, as well as the expenditure pressures.
We've seen the mining companies in the past spend big in fighting an advertising war on this. Should the government be afraid of taking on the miners again?
No government should ever take a backward step in pursuit of the national interest.
Just a final question. Kevin Rudd, how would you describe the way this year has started for Labor?
Well, it's election year. The Prime Minister reminded us of that at the very beginning when she nominated the election date. This is going to be tough, ugly and bloody. My hope, however, is that when it comes down to the business end of this, we have an election debate based on our policy record in taking this country through the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression versus the script which was put forward by the Liberal Party, which was to do nothing, and our plans for Australia's future versus their plans and whether they are properly costed. I think Mr Abbott's quite desperate attempt is to run for cover to avoid any level of scrutiny, as he did in the 2010 election.
But can this Prime Minister win, given what you've seen?
Of course the Australian Labor government can win, and can win under the Prime Minister's leadership.